Before it was a skyline, it was a hill. Not one hill, dozens. Mannahatta the Lenape called it, the island of many hills. Strip away every building ever raised on that rock, and what you'd find underneath is a landscape so dense with life it would stop you cold. 40 miles of shoreline, salt marshes along the edges, forests of oak and chestnut running up the spine, oyster beds so thick along the shore that the shells piled into reefs you could walk across at low tide. The Lenape had been living here for thousands of years. Moving with the seasons, harvesting what the estuary offered, trading along river routes that connected the interior of the continent to the coast. It wasn't wilderness in the way Europeans meant that word. It was managed, known, deeply inhabited. The Europeans who eventually came weren't even looking for it. In 1609, the Dutch East India Company, the most powerful trading corporation in the world at that moment, a company with its own army, its own navy, its own right to declare war, hired an English navigator named Henry Hudson to find a shortcut to Asia. The Northeast Passage, the Northwest Passage, any passage that would let Dutch merchants skip the Portuguese stranglehold on the southern trade routes. Hudson tried the Northeast first, hit ice, turned around. Then, in a decision his employers hadn't authorized, sailed west instead. He crossed the Atlantic, followed the coast south, looking for an opening. In September of 1609, he sailed his ship, the Halve Maen, into a wide harbor on the eastern edge of the continent. He sent a small boat up the river that would eventually carry his name. The river went north for 150 miles before it narrowed too much to be the passage he was searching for. He hadn't found Asia. But the men he sent ashore came back with something that mattered more to his employers than any spice route: beaver pelts. The European appetite for beaver fur in the early 1600s was not a minor commercial preference. It was an industrial obsession. Felt hats made from beaver under fur were the status symbol of the age. Every merchant, nobleman, and magistrate from London to Amsterdam wanted one. European beaver populations had been hunted to near extinction. North America had tens of millions. The distance between those two facts was a business opportunity of extraordinary scale, and the Dutch understood it immediately. Within a few years of Hudson's voyage, Dutch trading vessels were making regular runs to the river he'd mapped. By 1614, Dutch traders had built a small fort at the upper end of the navigable river, near what is now Albany, and were conducting a systematic trade with the Mohican and Haudenosaunee nations who controlled access to the interior fur supply. Manhattan at this stage was not the point. It was the door. The geography made it unavoidable, though. The harbor was one of the finest natural anchorages on the Atlantic coast. Deep enough for ocean-going vessels, sheltered from storms, positioned at the convergence of three waterways that reached into the continent's interior. Any serious operation along the Hudson River needed a base at its mouth. What became New York was not chosen because someone was brilliant. It was chosen because the water went where it went, and the water went past that particular island. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, was given exclusive rights to trade in the Americas. Unlike its older, richer cousin, the East India Company, the West India Company was always a scrappier, less profitable operation, more focused on raiding Spanish shipping than building lasting commercial infrastructure. Manhattan was assigned to it almost as an afterthought. The company needed a trading post. The island was there. The decision was made with roughly the same enthusiasm you'd apply to picking a warehouse location. That indifference would shape everything that followed. In 1624, the first permanent settlers arrived on Manhattan. A small group of Walloon families, Protestant refugees from the Spanish-controlled southern Netherlands, sent by the Dutch West India Company, not because the company had a grand vision for colonization, but because it needed warm bodies to hold a trading post. They were scattered almost immediately. Some sent up to Fort Nassau near Albany, some to the Delaware River. A few left on Manhattan. The company was not investing in these people. It was deploying them. By 1626, a director had been appointed to bring order to the operation. Peter Minuit, a man of Walloon origin himself, born in what is now Germany, arrived and made the transaction that became, centuries later, one of the most retold stories in American mythology. He arranged a trade with representatives of the Lenape people for the island of Manhattan. The goods exchanged were worth 60 guilders, a figure that Dutch records noted and that later generations converted, with varying degrees of precision, into $24. The English-speaking world eventually rounded this into a parable about the greatest real estate bargain in history. The story is more complicated than that, and the complication matters. The Lenape concept of land use was not the European concept of land ownership. When Lenape leaders accepted goods in exchange for allowing the Dutch to occupy and use a piece of territory, they understood themselves to be sharing access, not selling sovereignty. The Dutch understood themselves to be purchasing exclusive title. These were not two parties signing the same agreement. They were two parties signing different agreements in the same ceremony. And the misunderstanding was not accidental. It was structurally useful to the party with the cannons. Fort Amsterdam went up at the southern tip of the island. A windmill, a counting house, a church. By the early 1630s, New Amsterdam had perhaps 300 people. The company sent them supplies reluctantly. It sent settlers even more reluctantly. The fur trade was what mattered. The colony was overhead. Every time something went wrong in New Amsterdam, the company's solution was to appoint a director with more authority and hand him fewer resources. Among those brought to New Amsterdam in the colony's earliest years were enslaved Africans. The Dutch West India Company had been involved in the Atlantic slave trade since its founding, and it brought enslaved people to New Amsterdam to perform the labor the colony desperately needed: constructing the fort, clearing land, loading ships. By 1640, there were several dozen enslaved Africans in the colony. Their names appear in the records: Paulo d'Angola, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Gracia d'Angola. Real people with identifiable origins brought across an ocean to build a settlement on an island whose original inhabitants had already been displaced. The company eventually created a category it called half-freedom, a legal status that allowed certain enslaved Africans to live and work more or less independently, provided they paid an annual tribute to the company and performed labor when called upon. Their children, however, remained enslaved. Half-freedom was not emancipation. It was a management tool, a way to reduce the cost of maintaining a permanent enslaved labor force while retaining the essential control. By 1643, the colony had grown chaotic enough that a visiting Jesuit priest named Isaac Jogues noted he heard 18 different languages spoken in the streets of a settlement holding perhaps 500 people. Dutch, French, Portuguese, various African languages, Lenape dialects, English, German. The company's failure to attract committed Dutch settlers had produced something it hadn't intended: a genuinely polyglot outpost where no single culture dominated because no single culture had bothered to show up in sufficient numbers. Into this mess in 1647 came Peter Stuyvesant. He arrived with a silver-banded wooden leg. His right had been amputated after a Portuguese cannonball shattered it during a battle in the Caribbean, and a disposition toward order that the colony had never experienced, and mostly didn't want. Stuyvesant was capable, energetic, contemptuous of dissent, and convinced that good governance meant governance that didn't ask for opinions. He banned the sale of alcohol on Sundays. He tried to expel the first Jewish refugees who arrived in 1654, a group of 23 Sephardic Jews fleeing the Portuguese reconquest of Dutch Brazil, and was overruled by the West India Company, which noted, dryly, that Jewish investors held shares in the company and their coreligionists could not be turned away without consequence. He built the wall along the northern edge of the settlement that gave its name to a street that would one day become the most famous address in global finance. He governed like a man who knew exactly what needed to be done and had no patience for anyone who disagreed. In 1664, he ran out of time. In late August of 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into New York Harbor and anchored just off the tip of Manhattan. They carried enough guns and enough soldiers to take the colony by force. They also carried a letter from Colonel Richard Nichols, the commander of the English expedition, addressed to Peter Stuyvesant, informing him that the colony of New Netherland was now the property of the English crown, and inviting the Director General to surrender peaceably. Stuyvesant climbed to the walls of Fort Amsterdam. He looked at the ships. He understood the arithmetic. The fort had 24 cannon. Several were in poor repair. The colony had perhaps 150 men capable of fighting. The English had more soldiers than that on the ships alone, backed by a naval force the colony had no means of matching. Stuyvesant reportedly tore up the English letter and refused at first to let his colonists read it. When the contents became known anyway, the colonists signed a petition asking him to accept the terms. 93 people signed it, including his own son. no shots were fired. On September 8, 1664, Peter Stuyvesant surrendered New Amsterdam to the English. He marched out of the fort with what military honors the situation allowed. The colony that the Dutch West India Company had built with such reluctance, funded so inadequately and defended so carelessly, it passed into English hands without a single casualty. The English renamed it New York after James, Duke of York, the king's brother, to whom Charles II had granted the territory. James had financed the expedition. He got a city. What the English inherited was stranger and more valuable than they perhaps expected. 17 years of Stuyvesant's administration had created legal structures, property records, and commercial infrastructure that the new rulers found it practical to largely preserve. Dutch land grants were confirmed. Dutch property law filtered into the developing legal culture of the colony. Families named Van Cortlandt, Schuyler, Beekman, and Roosevelt stayed. Their Dutch origins encoded in the names of streets and neighborhoods that still exist today. The Dutch had failed to build a lasting political empire on Manhattan. They had succeeded, almost by accident, in building a commercial culture so functional that even their conquerors didn't want to replace it. They weren't done entirely. In 1673, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, a Dutch fleet sailed back into New York Harbor and retook the colony, briefly renaming it New Orange. They held it for about a year. The Treaty of Westminster in 1674 returned it to England, in exchange for Dutch control of Suriname. The Dutch got a colony in South America. The English kept the island that would eventually anchor the global financial system. History has not been kind to that particular trade. What the English takeover settled, more than anything, was the question of language. Dutch remained spoken in parts of New York State for generations. There are records of Dutch-speaking communities in the Hudson Valley as late as the early 1800s. But the colony's commercial and legal life shifted to English, and with it the city's orientation shifted. From the Amsterdam-centered trading world of the Dutch to the London-centered imperial economy of the British. The Dutch West India Company had wanted beaver pelts. The English crown wanted a continent. And New York, positioned exactly where the water met the land, was how you got there. The British ran New York for over a century. For most of that time, it was the second or third most important city in North America. Prosperous, growing, occasionally turbulent, but not yet singular. Then the Revolution came, and New York got a lesson in what it meant to be a city that everyone needed and no one entirely controlled. When the war broke out in 1775, New York's Loyalist population was substantial, perhaps the largest of any major colonial city. The Continental Army tried to hold it, lost it catastrophically in the Battle of Brooklyn in August 1776, and watched the British move in. The city burned twice, once in September 1776 in a fire of uncertain origin that destroyed roughly a quarter of its buildings, and again in 1778. For 7 years, it was the operational headquarters of British forces in North America, crammed with soldiers, prisoners, and Loyalist refugees. When the British finally evacuated in November 1783, they took approximately 30,000 Loyalists with them and left behind a city that was physically damaged and politically transformed. What came next happened fast. By 1785, New York was the capital of the new United States. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president on the balcony of Federal Hall, at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. It's the same block where traders would soon be making fortunes. The capital moved to Philadelphia in 1790, then to the new federal district on the Potomac. New York was left to do what it had always done best: commerce. On May 17, 1792, 24 stockbrokers and merchants signed an agreement under a buttonwood tree on Wall Street. The Buttonwood Agreement established the basic rules for trading securities among themselves. Fixed commissions, a preference for dealing with each other over outside brokers. It was not a dramatic founding moment. It was a practical arrangement among businessmen who wanted to reduce the chaos of auction-style trading. From that modest agreement, the New York Stock Exchange eventually grew. Then came the Erie Canal. When Governor DeWitt Clinton championed the canal in the early 1800s, it was called Clinton's Ditch by its critics. A 363-mile trench through upstate New York wilderness that would cost a fortune and connect nothing to nothing. When it opened in October 1825, it connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and through the Great Lakes to the entire agricultural interior of the continent. Before the canal, shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City cost around $100 and took 2 weeks. After, roughly $10 and 8 days. The effect on New York's commerce was not gradual. It was a detonation. Within a decade, the city's port was handling more cargo than Boston, Baltimore, and New Orleans combined. Grain, lumber, and raw materials poured east. Manufactured goods and immigrants poured west. New York became the funnel through which America moved. The immigrants were the next layer. The Irish came first in staggering numbers, driven by the famine that killed 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. They arrived hungry, sick, with nothing, and they built the city's infrastructure with their bodies, the sewers, the roads, the buildings. After them came Germans, many of them political refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848, springing skills in manufacturing, brewing, and radical politics. Then Eastern European Jews, fleeing the pogroms that swept the Russian Empire in the 1880s and after. Tailors, merchants, intellectuals, socialists, rabbis, all of them compressed into the Lower East, side in densities that made the tenements physically dangerous. By 1900, New York had more Irish-born residents than Dublin, more Italians than Naples, more Jews than Warsaw. Each wave built the city. Each wave was in turn exploited by it. The mechanism of exploitation was efficient and bipartisan. Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that ran the city's politics for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, was not simply corrupt in the way the word suggests a few bad actors. It was a system. Tammany bosses provided immigrants with jobs, housing assistance, and legal help in exchange for votes, an exchange that worked in a limited sense for both parties. It also concentrated enormous power in the hands of a political organization that extracted money from city contracts, police protection for vice operations, and patronage positions at every level of municipal government. The machine served immigrants just enough to keep them voting. It served its operators considerably more. What Tammany couldn't contain showed itself in July of 1863, when the federal government instituted a Civil War draft and included a provision allowing wealthy men to pay $300 to avoid service. The working-class neighborhoods of New York exploded. For 4 days, mobs burned draft offices, attacked the homes of Republican officials, and turned their violence with particular ferocity against Black New Yorkers. They burned a Black orphanage. They hunted men in the streets. At least 119 people were killed, according to contemporary accounts, though historians have estimated the actual toll was likely higher. The targets were Black men. The rage was about class. It was both things simultaneously. A war fought by poor white immigrants who were being forced to die for a cause that rich men were buying their way out of, and a race war against people who had nothing to do with that arrangement. The city's economic miracle had been built on the labor of the people least able to afford its failures. The draft riots were what happened when that bill came due. October 24th, 1929 was a Thursday. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange opened as usual that morning. By midday, it was in free fall. Stocks that had been climbing for years, on a wave of speculation, borrowed money, and genuine industrial growth, began dropping with a speed the ticker tape machines couldn't keep up with. The tickers ran hours behind. Investors around the country were watching numbers that no longer existed, losses that had already grown larger than what the tape showed. The following Tuesday was worse. New York's banks were at the center of it. The city's financial institutions had extended credit on a scale that assumed growth would continue indefinitely. When it didn't, the contraction moved at the speed of a financial system that had become, over a century, the operational heart of the American economy. What happened on Wall Street did not stay on Wall Street. It moved through every bank, every business, every farm that had borrowed on the assumption that tomorrow would look like yesterday. The city survived the Depression as it had survived every previous crisis. Through federal intervention, sheer demographic mass, and the persistent reality that even in catastrophe you still needed a port, a financial center, a place where money and goods moved. World War II accelerated the recovery in ways that permanently changed New York's relationship to global finance. When the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed in 1944, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency and New York as the de facto center of international banking, it formalized something that had been developing for decades. London, weakened by 2 wars and an empire coming apart at the seams, ceded the position it had held for 2 centuries. New York inherited it by default and by design. But the city that came out of the post-war boom was already splitting along lines that the boom itself was drawing. The middle class the war economy and the GI Bill created, white largely, moved to the suburbs. The highways Robert Moses built to connect those suburbs to the city cut through urban neighborhoods with a casualness about displacement that, examined closely, tracks almost perfectly along racial lines. The South Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, Harlem, neighborhoods that had been dense and functional, if poor, were bisected, destabilized, and eventually abandoned by the same municipal infrastructure that was subsidizing the departure of white residents to Long Island and Westchester. They didn't just leave, they were helped out the door. By the early 1970s, New York was broke, not metaphorically broke, literally unable to meet its payroll. Years of fiscal mismanagement, a declining tax base, the cost of administered city that the federal and state governments had stopped adequately funding, it all collapsed at once. In October 1975, President Gerald Ford refused to authorize a federal bailout. The next morning's Daily News ran a headline that became one of the most famous in American journalism. Ford to city, drop dead. Ford hadn't said those exact words. The headline was an editorial. Compression. But the sentiment was accurate enough. New York was on its own. The city negotiated its way back through genuine austerity. Municipal workers accepted pension fund investments in city bonds to keep the government solvent. Tens of thousands of city employees were laid off. Services contracted sharply. The people who felt those contractions most acutely were the people who depend most on city services. The poor, the elderly, the residents of neighborhoods the city had been walking away from for a decade. The fiscal crisis didn't create inequality in New York. It made it structural. The crack epidemic that hit the city's poorest neighborhoods in the mid-1980s arrived into that landscape of deliberate neglect. The South Bronx, parts of Harlem, sections of Brooklyn that had been redlined, starved of investment, and cut off from the post-war prosperity that restructured the rest of the metropolitan area. These were the places where the drug moved fastest and the damage went deepest. Landlords in some neighborhoods were burning their own buildings for insurance money. Blocks were going dark. The city's response when it came primarily in the form of police and prisons rather than housing or treatment. Then September 11, 2001. 2 towers came down. 2,977 people died. The grief was real and vast. And the city changed in subtler ways too. Security infrastructure expanded, surveillance deepened, the financial district that had been somewhat emptying of residential life began to repopulate as the neighborhood rebuilt around the site of the attack. The diversity of the dead, workers from dozens of countries, people of every religion and economic background who had converged on those buildings for the ordinary reasons people go to work, was repeatedly cited as evidence of the city's essential character. That was true. It was also incomplete. The first responders who got sick from the toxic debris cloud spent years fighting for healthcare coverage the government was reluctant to provide. The Muslim communities of Queens and Brooklyn faced waves of suspicion and surveillance that were not directed at other communities. The grief was shared. The consequences were not. In 1991, construction workers excavating the foundation for a federal office building in Lower Manhattan hit something unexpected several feet below street level. Human bones. Archaeologists were called in. What they found over the following months was a burial ground containing the remains of over 400 people, with evidence suggesting the site had once held perhaps 15,000 graves. These were the remains of enslaved and free Black New Yorkers, buried here between the late 1600s and 1795, in a cemetery that had been sealed under layers of landfill and construction for nearly 2 centuries. The African burial ground is now a national monument, 1 block north of City Hall, surrounded by the federal buildings eventually built over most of its extent. The 419 sets of remains that were recovered have been reinterred with ceremony. The site is marked and honored. For 200 years, it was parking lots and landfill. The people buried there had built this city. The records that survive from New Amsterdam and early British New York show them constructing the fort, clearing the land, loading the ships, doing the labor that the Dutch West India Company refused to pay wages for. They were present at the founding in a way that most of the founders never acknowledged. And for most of the city's history, they weren't merely forgotten. They were buried under the infrastructure of the financial capital their labor helped create. The Lenape name for the island. Mannahatta, the island of many hills, survived. The hills didn't. By the 19th century, the natural topography of Manhattan had been aggressively flattened to accommodate the street grid that city commissioners imposed on the island in 1811. The marshes were filled, the streams buried in pipes. The oyster reefs that had fed the Lenape for thousands of years were harvested to extinction by the early 1900s, victims of the same industrial appetite the harbor had been serving since the first Dutch trading ships arrived. The name lasted. The landscape it described was erased. The myth of New York as the melting pot is one of the most durable stories the city tells about itself. It isn't entirely false. People from more places have converged on this particular island than perhaps anywhere else in human history, and something genuinely new has emerged from that convergence. In language, in food, in music, in the specific texture of what it means to be a New Yorker. But melting pot implies a blending, a dissolution of difference into a common substance. The reality of the 5 boroughs is more like a layered geology, each community compressed against the others, shaped by the pressure but distinct, with its own memory of how it arrived and what it cost to stay. The people who built New York's infrastructure moved its goods, cooked its food, cleaned its offices, and kept its machinery running at every stage of its history. They are not, for the most part, the people whose names are on the buildings. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. Those are the names the city raised in stone and steel. The Irish laborers who dug the Erie Canal at $1 a day and a jigger of whiskey. The Jewish garment workers of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. 146 of them burned to death in 1911 because the doors were locked and the fire escapes collapsed. The Puerto Rican and black families displaced by urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s to make room for Lincoln Center and the Cross Bronx Expressway. They built it too. Their names are in the archives if anyone goes looking. New York is not a triumph. It is not a tragedy. It's something more honest than either. A place where the forces that shaped the modern world arrived in concentrated form and produced something that has no clean moral resolution. Capital. Migration, violence, ambition, displacement. All of it compressed onto one island over 400 years. The hills are gone. The name is still there. That gap between what a place was and what it became and what it chose to remember is the actual history of New York.